Hello, BookTube. In this video, I'm going to finish up my chapter-by-chapter, section-by-section read-through of The Return of the King, the third part of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. We are not dealing with chapters anymore because we're not dealing with the story proper anymore. Instead, we're dealing with the appendices that Tolkien added to this book at the end. After the end. After the story proper, after the narrative concludes. On a wonderfully subdued note, we get a vast amount of appendices. And they range from, like we saw in Appendix A, grand, although analytic storytelling that occasionally does rise to the level of narrative, of what happened next and characters involved. It starts at that high point, and it goes down from there. So that you have, one of the appendices here is about family trees, which I showed you. One of them is about alphabets. I mean, Tolkien was a linguist. But that is not much of an excuse for giving readers page after page of a breakdown of alphabets. There's no excuse for doing that. There's a pronunciation guide here, etc., etc., etc. And it always reminds me, every time I come across this part of this book, it reminds me of a talk that the great science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin gave decades and decades and decades ago. It was a normal talk. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary. She got this question a lot. But when she was done talking, she opened up the floor to questions from the audience, and one very nervous-looking young thing walked up to the microphone and said, "How do you pronounce the name of the place the ones walk away from? Thank you." It was clearly the highlight of her entire life to ask that question, referring to the ones who walk away from Omelas. And obviously, Ursula Le Guin had gotten that question before, and she said, "Well, you can pronounce it any way you like." And I always think about that when I get to overly persnickety, factoid stuff like this in epic fantasies, where you're always going to find it. And then, as we're wrapping up, the appendices that we're wrapping up are not only about language, which has a couple of interesting things in it that we'll go over, but also about historiography, about how this record is actually transmitted at all. It doesn't matter, and it doesn't make sense. When you learn the ways that it's transmitted, they don't line up with the book that you've just read. So they shouldn't have been in here. But I want to read you two interesting bits from Appendix F, which is on the languages of the various peoples of Middle-earth. And in order to give us a little disquisition on the languages of the various peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien has to talk about the various peoples of Middle-earth, and one of them, it always catches me by surprise. It is such fodder for Lord of the Rings Part 2, which every fan thinks about. No matter how much, I love this book short of anybody, but I often think what stories could be told. Not only a Lord of the Rings style epic about the stuff that is sketched in the appendices but not told, which is what for about a minute I was foolishly hoping that Amazon's Rings of Power would be, but also what stories could you tell about the Fourth Age? Could you make a heroic story about the Fourth Age? Wouldn't be about the Lord of the Rings, although we don't have an absolutely definitive answer to the question of whether or not Sauron is dead. Right? We know that he's defeated and dissipated, that he's a ghost of his former self and can never regain shape or strength. But we have that on the assurance of a couple of characters who don't know one way or another. They're pronouncing that for sure. Sure, Elrond can sound really sure about things, but how much is he wrong about in Lord of the Rings? That's one thing. But in addition to that, we don't know what leftover evils there are in the world. Was Smaug from The Hobbit the last sizable dragon anywhere on Middle-earth? And how big does a dragon have to be before a dragon can cause trouble? It seems to me that the dragons in Game of Thrones were causing plenty of trouble when they were as big as beagles. But this is another example of that, because one of the races that we get at least a brief hint of a language for, of course, Tolkien wants to talk about orcs. And that brings him to talk about trolls, and whether or not trolls have a language, and whether or not they can learn any language. And then he gets to this. At the end of the Third Age, a troll race not before seen appeared in the southern Mirkwood and in the mountain borders of Mordor. Ologhai, they were called in the black speech. Not Uruk-hai, but Ologhai. That Sauron bred them none doubted, though from what stock was not known. Some held that they were not trolls, but giant orcs. But the Ologhai were in fashion of body and mind quite unlike even the largest of orc kind. They far surpassed in size and power. Trolls they were, but filled with the evil will of their master, a fell race, strong, agile, fierce, and cunning, but harder than stone. Unlike the older race of the Twilight, they could endure the sun so long as the will of Sauron held sway over them. They spoke little, and the only tongue they knew was the black speech of Barad-dûr. So we're talking about, trolls in Tolkien are enormous, right? If you haven't read Tolkien, you'll know that from the movies. They're big. They're big creatures. They're considerably bigger in the movies than they are in the books, but even in the books, they're quite big. They're enormous things. Treebeard, for instance, tells us that they were made in mockery of the Ents, both in strength and in size. The Ologhai are very different. They are bigger than orcs, but they aren't giant. They are troll-sized, and they're super powerful. Agile, cunning, they speak. They're invulnerable to bladed weapons. They could be a real big problem. We're told that they arose at the end of the Third Age. Well, when we drop off our characters, it's the end of the Third Age, and the very earliest days, the first 100 years of the Fourth Age. What has happened to the Ologhai? Are they around? Do they have a chieftain? They maybe have some aspirations. If people hacking at you with bladed weapons can't hurt you, why wouldn't you have aspirations for farmsteads and local kingdoms and whatnot? I thought that was fascinating. I wouldn't love to see the Tolkien estate authorize anything like that. Nevertheless, there's a part of me that wonders what a really good fantasy author would do with all the pieces that are left. Celeborn is still in Middle-earth. Thranduil is still in Middle-earth. Legolas and Gimli are still in Middle-earth. There may be dragons. There is at least one wizard. Radagast is still in Middle-earth. The Sons of Elrond are in Middle-earth. There's a cast that you could assemble. But anyway, that was one thing that I wanted to mention from that we're picking the tiny little bits and pieces out of the appendices that we can actually talk about, because I can't talk about tables of alphabets. God help us. But the other thing that I'm always struck by it when I read it is about the dwarf language, which we're told the dwarves are extremely secretive about it. They're perfectly happy to adapt to the common speech or to other languages, but they're very secretive about their own language. And at the end of that brief section on dwarf language, we learn something shocking. We learn that we don't know Gimli's name. It probably stands to reason that we don't know any of the dwarves' names from, for instance, The Hobbit. But we don't know Gimli's name. We spent 1,000 pages with this character, and we don't actually know his name. It's as much of a revelation as that moment in Star Trek when we learned that we don't know Mr. Spock's real name. I am, of course, discounting New Trek's decision to give him a name. I'm, of course, discounting that. If something is canon for 60 years, then it's canon. You don't get to just walk in and change it. So, but I remember that watching that episode, This Side of Paradise, when Leela Kalani says to Spock, "You never did tell me your name." And I was watching the episode. I was thinking, "What are you talking about? You've been calling him Mr. Spock the whole episode. We've been calling him Mr. Spock for a year." And instead of Spock saying to her, "Well, what do you mean?" he says, "You couldn't pronounce it." So he does have a name that we don't know. And we learn that same thing here. Tolkien writes, Gimli's own name, however, and the names of all his kin, are of northern, that is, mannish origin. Their own secret and inner names, their true names, the dwarves have never revealed to anyone of alien race. Not even on their tombs do they inscribe them. That's pretty interesting, I think. That's pretty interesting. And that is going to do it for the appendices here. There's not much else to talk about here, I think. I mean, you could sift through here for grains of interest like those, but they're few and far between. So now I have a choice here for book 2. I can either take a pause and then move on to the Fellowship of the Ring and start with we'll just do a chapter by chapter read through of the Lord of the Rings, or I can vent a little about Amazon's The Rings of Power, which was allegedly derived from the appendices of this book. That's what $1 billion was handed over the table for the rights to use that, to adapt the appendices. Not The Lord of the Rings, but the appendices. It's not going to matter. It's a tempest in a teapot. Money will win the day. If there's anything that we know about this new horrific Gilded Age we live in, it's that money will win the day. Which means that, especially now that Christopher Tolkien is gone, sooner rather than later, we're all going to see a completely revamped Lord of the Rings with a multiracial cast, with a polyamorous cast, with a diversity, equity, and inclusion cast, a DEI cast, just like the Rings of Power. The Rings of Power completely desecrates not only the appendices from which it was drawn, but all of Tolkien. Completely desecrates what the showrunners refer to as the source material that they claim to love. There's no way that you get to do that. There's no way that you get interrupted in a graveyard digging up a corpse in order to hack off its head and play ball with it. There's no way you get interrupted doing that and say, I'm doing this out of love. I love the source material. There's no way you get to do that. No matter how much spin anybody can be drafted to put on it. And I don't know if that's worth a whole video. I'm not sure that it is. I'm pretty sure that the incredible long list of the sins of the Rings of Power is well known by now. It hasn't changed anything. In the 21st century, you gauge your success. If you are a corporation, if you're throwing around millions or billions of dollars, you gauge your success by how much people hate what you do, by how much money you lose from it. And that is psychotic. That is an attitude that's completely divorced from reality. You're enjoying the thing that's ruining your business. That's completely divorced from reality, and yet that is everywhere. That is social justice warrior type psychosis, where you look at manifest failure and you say, well, that means I'm doing something right. I have to cancel the comic book Captain Marvel 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, 9 times, 10 times, all for low sales. Never for any other reason, all for low sales. And every single time I cancel it, not only me, the writer and the artist and whatnot, but the editors above us say, oh, this is incredible. Oh, we're definitely doing something right. We're bringing this back right away. We won't change it at all either. We'll even bring along the same creative crew that the readers have voted out with their wallets 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, 9 times. Doesn't matter. In fact, it does matter. If we're doing that, if people are hating what we're doing, then we're on the right side of history and we're doing something right. A major beer company can lose billions of dollars over a decision made purely to taunt their fan base, purely for that reason. And I guarantee you the conversations in the boardrooms are, unless there are actual money people in the room, they appear not to have any voice anymore. But the guarantee the conversations in the boardrooms are, boy, this was a total success. You have to let go of an entire division because we're losing billions of dollars. But that is fantastic. I'm so happy that this was a complete failure. And the same thing is true with the Rings of Power. The 2 teenage showrunners and the gigantic talentless cast have to know how much Tolkien fans hated this crap. And I guarantee you, there's a season 2. It's in production. $1 billion will be spent on it. I guarantee you that the attitude was, well, if we're universally hated for this, we've got to be doing something right. It's this weird, stupid, warped, through the looking glass, completely narcissistic Rosa Parks moment thinking that could not be any further divorced from reality. And it completely governed the Rings of Power. Even after the initial genuine audience reactions came in, Amazon did its best to try and buy audience reactions, and that failed. And it kept failing. And it wasn't just the neck-bearded, quasi-fascist, alt-right YouTubers that were showing that it failed. No one liked it. Virtually no one liked it. And the ones who did have a strong whiff of Stockholm Syndrome that, I guess if I hunt long enough and hard enough, I can find something good to say about this. It's not Tolkien, but I can maybe find something good to say about it. But screw that. It was supposed to be Tolkien. It was $1 billion was spent in order for it to be Tolkien. The Tolkien estate was courted on the explicit assumption that it would be Tolkien. It was only when the guardian of that estate died that suddenly, no, no. And now, season 2, well, anyway, I'm not sure that it's worth a whole video to the extent that this was not that video. But we're going to finish up. We're finishing up with the appendices. And then whatever I decide to do, you'll, of course, be the first to know. Because we are going to continue. We're going to wrap around to the Fellowship of the Ring so that somebody can teach me how to make a playlist, and we can have a playlist of the whole of the Lord of the Rings. And then what do we do next? Do we move chapter by chapter through some other book? By far, the highest number of suggestions for that other book is the Silmarillion. I just did a Silmarillion buddy read. Didn't I just recently do one? I guess it wouldn't be as meticulous as this kind of a read-through, as a chapter by chapter read-through would. We'll have to see. We have a long way to go, because we have all of the Fellowship to do. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. That is the end of the Return of the King, as far as I'm concerned. So we'll take a pause, and then we'll come back to the Fellowship. And I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.